Welcome to the podcast. Eric is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. The early episodes of this podcast have described what his life was like being born into 1925 London and living in complete poverty. And although poor, he was happy with his family. But then one day his mum left, never to return. His father gave him and his brother over to a boys' home in Burgess Hill, and those episodes described what life was like under the harsh discipline of the master of the house. In this episode, we see that there is definitely a turn to a better life. It wasn't long after I had volunteered for farm work that I was told I would be leaving in a fortnight. There were 3 of us leaving at the same time, and we were excited. Secretly, I had other thoughts, wondering how we were going to cope in a new home. This was our next stop. It was like a staging post, where we would be indoctrinated into the employment we had chosen. The day finally came for us to leave, and we were dressed in new clothes, not uniforms. We also were each given a case for our possessions. We were then taken to the railway station by the master and handed over to the guard. He became responsible for us from then on, which turned out to be a pleasant experience. We travelled to London, where we changed trains for one going to Exeter. Another guard took charge of us, and he was an equally nice man. We each had a bag of sandwiches, and with the freedom that we were allowed, we quite enjoyed the journey. Our destination was to a quaint little village called Sampford Peveril in Devon, where we were met by a man with a large car, and we had a nice ride through the countryside. When we finally arrived at the home, we noticed it was a very large building with big black fire escapes outside each wall. There was no huge brick wall and no huge green gate. It stood on its own ground and was quite open. We were met at the door by a man and his wife who appeared to be a very friendly couple. Inside the house, the walls were painted in light colours, and there were separate dining tables and far superior bedrooms. We were elated. It was as if a load had been taken off of our shoulders. The boys had bedside lockers, but there were no photos on them, posters on the walls, and even flowers on the windowsills. We were met by other boys who were walking about in pairs or groups who showed us around. It was amazing. At tea time, we were shown to our table, one for each group of 4 boys. It was a civilized meal. We had a plateful of sandwiches to each table and a metal teapot with our own milk and sugar. There were pictures of famous sportsmen on the dining room walls and other friendly pictures on the corridor walls. It even had its own little chapel where services were conducted by visiting clergy or missionaries. It was such a different experience, and it took us days to take it all in. But it was not a holiday camp. The leader, not a master, was a disciplinarian, and there were strict rules to observe. Punishments were meted out, but it was usually extra housework, or we might miss out on sports activities. That was quite severe enough to pull us up and make us behave properly. We had a carpentry shop, a science room, and even a catering-sized kitchen, also vegetable gardens. Whatever job the boys chose to work at, this became their place of training. It was strict and hard work, but we all felt so useful. I stayed at the training home for another 3 weeks, during which time I had received intensive training on self-discipline and respect for the employer. During this time, some boys were released on day training programs at local shops, council park authorities, and with nearby building contractors. I never came under those categories, but my workload was just as critical. Eventually I was told that I would be leaving as soon as a farm had been found for me. Once again I was fitted out in suitable clothing, sturdy boots, corduroy breeches, warm vest and a shirt with a waistcoat and jacket. It all looked very rural. It wasn't long after I had volunteered for farm work that I was on my way. Suddenly I felt very insecure and was quite worried as to what my future was going to be. Would they be nice people? Would they be very strict and bullies? Who would I turn to? These were the thoughts that were running through my mind. On the day, I was driven to the station by the leader and suitably labelled. I was once again placed in the care of the railway guard. We had to travel a small distance to the next station, which was at Columpton. At this station, I was met by a very nice young man dressed in clothes much like the ones I had been issued. He took my baggage and we walked toward a very nice looking car. I sat in the front with him and he was very friendly and put me at ease. He told me to relax and that I was going to have a very nice time. Off we went, down a lovely country road which eventually began to rise up to a hill. At the top was a large white farm gate across the entrance to a long drive. I willingly jumped out to open the gate and close it again after he drove in. Already I was working and it was so exciting. I was a worker. At the end of the drive was a very old thatched farmhouse, painted white with a tarred base all around. It had very small framed windows and big oak doors. It looked very inviting. He unloaded my baggage and took me to the front door. When it opened, I was met by a very old couple. He was the farmer, and the other chap was a worker like me. Beside the farmer was his wife. They took me inside, shook my hand, and made me feel very welcome. There were dogs walking around who gave me some close scrutiny, but they were soon to become my best friends. The worker left the house, and as he went, he patted my head and wished me good luck. I was taken upstairs by the lady and shown my bedroom. It was a very small room, and there were 2 beds in there with a locker between them. She told me to get changed, and she would make me a drink. In fact, it was a glass of fresh milk. The farmer had left the house by then, so she said she would show me around. We sat in a dine-in kitchen room, which was sparsely furnished. There was a huge inglenook fireplace with a bench seat on either side of the fire. There were also 2 large wooden rocking chairs on either side, and in the center was a large scrubbed table. Along one wall was a sideboard with cupboards and drawers. On top was a big wireless. As I sat on my bench seat, I looked up at the huge chimney and was amazed. There were huge chunks of meat hanging up there in the smoke. The lady saw the expression on my face and explained that they were bacon hams curing. Then it was time to show me around some more, and we left this area to walk along a narrow passage. At the first door on the right, she showed me a beautiful Victorian-style sitting room. She explained that we only used this room on Sundays. Further along the passage, there was a large black door, and when she opened it, we were in a dairy. It had a red tiled floor, and there were countertops that had marble surfaces that remained very cold. The lady showed me an iron grill in the floor, under which ran a fresh water stream. There were huge china basins on the shelves, and a gleaming array of milk measures hanging on the wall. Also on another shelf held cheeses and bowls of cream. It all looked very interesting. We left the dairy by another door, and suddenly we were in a huge barn. Inside were all types of machinery and a large stack of sacks. There were lots of cats and chickens running around. I soon realized that this large farmhouse was 1/3 living quarters, and the rest was a working area. We went back into the dining area, and she told me to sit down and make myself comfortable. She said the boss would soon be back. Eventually he came in, and after removing his Wellingtons, he came and sat down opposite me. He called me my Bucky, which I accepted. I felt at ease with him. He asked how I was, how long I had been in the home, and how well I got on. It was a cozy, friendly little chat, and I'm sure he was making me feel welcome. After a hot cup of tea, he said, "Come on, lad, put your boots on, and I will take you to the cowshed." He placed a very old trill we had on his head, which had been shaped and moulded from his leaning against the cow's sides. When we were in the shed, I could see the cows in their individual stalls. They all stopped munching and one by one started looking around. It was as if they were all sizing me up. The farmer picked up a 3-legged stool and told me to follow him and to watch and learn. He started milking, and then he was joined by his wife. She looked very strange, as she was wearing brown overalls and had a sack tied around her waist. She also had on an old trilby, but this time the brim was missing. It was well worn and looked like an inverted basin. I went back to where she was, as I felt more comfortable with her. She had in her hand a small enamel basin with a sponge, which she was using to wash the cow's udders. It smelled very clean and mildly of a disinfectant, and then she sat on her stool and started milking. It all looked very simple, and within minutes, and with the bucket 1/3 full, we moved along to the next cow, and the procedure started again. This went on until their buckets were full. She told me to follow her to the next stage. The milk was taken to a building at the end of the shed that was spotlessly clean. It had a brick floor, and the walls were made up of slatted wood. There was cold air blowing through all the time. In here were the milk coolers where they emptied their buckets. From the cooler, the milk travelled through stainless steel pipes into a churn. One bucket of cooled milk was put aside and later on taken into the dairy for drinking, cream and cheese making. When all milking was finished, the cows were put out into their nighttime meadow. We then walked into the stream, running through the yard to wash our Wellingtons. Our hands and arms were scrubbed clean with strong soap and several rinses of cold water. It was now tea time, so we went into the dining area. The large table had been covered with a floral oil cloth. I noticed there were 4 places sat at the table. The reason for this became apparent. The door latch lifted and in walked the other gentleman I had met earlier. The farmer introduced him as George and said that he was the carter. I was told this meant he was in charge of the horses and all their workload. George shook my hand very firmly and welcomed me into the fold. He also mentioned that his was the second bed in my room. We were going to become true friends and work together. Now I felt really wanted. By this time the wife had brought in a huge tureen of stew and dumplings. There were also bowls of hot steaming vegetables, potatoes and carrots. There were mountains of them, or so it seemed. It was delicious, and I ate my whole plateful thinking that it was chicken. Imagine my surprise at being told it was rabbit. I was offered a second helping, but reluctantly refused. After tea, George told me to go with him and he would show me the horses. I was amazed. I had never seen such large beasts, and they were so gentle. George petted their rumps and told them to move over, and we walked alongside to their heads. Each horse in turn was allowed to sniff me and make their inspection. I was able to pat their noses and also rub their heads between their ears. The first horse was called Farmer, and the oldest horse was called Blossom. After our introductions were over, George took me outside and told me to go wandering and do some exploring. He had to get tomorrow's harnesses clean and ready for work. The first thing I discovered was that at the back of the house I could hear water trickling down. It was the beginning of the spring water stream. It ran along a little way and then went under the floor of the dairy, out the other side again, and further along it turned across a small corner of the field. There it went through the hedgerow and through a pipe into the long watering trough where we had previously washed our hands. It then overflowed into a channel which ran along the front of the pigsties, then onto the cattle shed and away into the fields. This then was their continuous supply of fresh, clean water. The trough in the dairy was deep enough to bail out water for cooking and drinking. I also discovered the apple orchard where there were pigs roaming about, and they also seemed to be quite placid and allowed me to approach them. There were apples lying about everywhere. That was enough exploring for now, and so I went back to George. As it was now getting dark, we decided to go indoors. I went to my seat by the fireplace, and George sat at the table with a magazine. It was then that I noticed there were no electric or gas lights. The lady had placed a large oil lamp on the table that had a large white globe, while the farmer was busy filling another lamp by the kitchen door. Eventually the room became quite pungent with the smell of paraffin burning. It was all very cozy. I just sat there looking into the wood flames and daydreamed. What a lovely day it had been. Soon the farmer announced it was time for bed. I had to be up early. He handed me a candlestick to light my way up the stairs into my room. I was soon tucked up in bed and in the land of Nod. It didn't seem long after I had been asleep that someone was shaking my shoulder and telling me to wake up. It was George, and as I became fully awake, I realized there was a candle lit, so it was obviously still dark. It all felt very strange. We went downstairs to the back door, where there were 2 oil lanterns lit. We picked up one each and then went outside. It was still dark. Our job was to fetch the cows in. We didn't have to go far, as the cows were at the gate waiting to enter. But what surprised me most was the fact that at the front of them all was a large white billy goat. George explained that this was the herd leader and the cows all had to obey him. The goat led them into the yard, and when he was satisfied, he disappeared across the field to wait on them. George explained that apart from looking after the cows and calves, he'd also scare off any foxes. The goat ate a certain type of weed that, if eaten by the cows, would taint the milk. He was quite a character. As I had arrived on a Friday, and this was Saturday, it was sort of a day off. I watched some milking being done, and also watched George cleaning out and grooming his horses. I watched him harnessing them up for work. He explained that on Saturday he and the horses did light work until dinner time just to keep them in trim. Meanwhile, I was told to wander off to explore the farmland. First, I went to the trough to wash my hands and face before returning inside. I took my usual place, and the fire was blazing away with a bundle of brushwood placed on top. A large black kettle was simmering away, and there were also huge pots of boiling water. I soon learned that the bundles of wood were called faggots, and they were birch or beech trimmings. These were collected and stacked like a haystack. Soon the farmer and George came in, and after removing their boots at the door, they took their place at the table. The farmer beckoned me forward to my place, and asked me if I had slept well and what I thought of getting up so early. George joined in the conversation, and it was just like a normal family at the breakfast table. While this was going on, the wife had been preparing breakfast, which consisted of eggs, bacon, and cubed potatoes, along with a slice of thick, dry bread. The bacon was a thick rasher that had obviously been cut off a side of bacon. The fat was streaky and yellow-looking, and the rind still had bristles on it. It had been cooked on an oil stove and tasted like it, but it was delicious. I thoroughly enjoyed it. All that was washed down with a large mug of tea, and when I finished, I was able to leave the table to go outside. No more dishes or washing up. I wandered off into the first field, and that is when I met him. He was a large white goose and had 2 grey females with him. There was a lot of commotion going on, and he came toward me, neck outstretched and with lots of threatening hisses. He was very bold and gave me a good hard nip on the ankle, and then he went back to his mates, chattering and tossing his neck up and down and probably telling them he was still in charge. I stood quietly mesmerized for a few minutes, and then walked on, but up he came again and saw me quickly off. The goose wasn't the only animal keeping watch over me. I soon found myself being followed by 2 lovely dogs. I called them, and they came running. They soon were lying down very submissively. Their tails were wagging, and it was obvious they were glad to see me. One was a black and white collie called Danny, and the other was a liver and cream-coloured dog called Bess. They were so excited. They ran around and around, barking with glee. Suddenly, a little brown and white doggy came bounding up to greet me. He was a Jack Russell Terrier called Jack. Danny was used as a cattle drover. Bess was a dog used for shooting weekends, and little Jack was the hunter, rats, mice, and rabbits. He was also the boss over the other 2. He was a busy, ambitious dog, and when working was totally engrossed in the job at hand. The 4 of us became great friends and almost inseparable. Whenever I went out for free time, we would go off exploring together. I learned to whistle to call Danny and became very good at it, so much so that I used to take him to fetch in the cows. This was especially useful when they were out in the fields, farthest away from the farm. Bess was a highly trained gun dog, and her only boss would be the farmer. As for Jack, he would be his own boss, although he would come if called. My daily chores were becoming more interesting every day. On one day, the farmer asked me to accompany him to the barn, where he handed me my tools for the day. He gave me a sickle and a stick that had an elbow at one end, while he had a large scythe. He also grabbed 2 long canes with a rag tied on one end. We then went off to a field where he placed a cane in the ground, about 4 yards from the edge. Then he walked to the far end of the field where he placed the second cane, the same distance from the edge. This would be the area we would be working. We paced ourselves apart and walked across the field. I was attempting to cut down thistle and docks, while he swept along with his scythe. When we got to the end, we moved the cane up another 4 paces, and off we went again. We did this until the field was finished, the idea being to get rid of the weeds, which would spoil the hay. I eventually made friends with old Bossy Boots, the goose, and now when I let him out, he would run at me, head held high, but no more hissing or threats. He'd still mutter and mumble, telling the girls how brave he was, though. And then there were my chickens. I really did like them, especially their magnificent cockerels. I named quite a lot of the hens, and they would come running whenever they saw me, especially when I had the food bucket. I used to love having friendly chats with them. The cows were also becoming very friendly towards me, and now when I started milking, I no longer got any crafty swipes with their tails. I was also taught to hand feed the calves when they were being weaned. They had a special milk powder made up with water and minerals. The idea was that I would place my hand in the bottom of the bucket with my fingers upward. The calves would suckle until the bucket was empty. Naturally, they became very tame, and I had made more friends who would look for me every day, even out in the fields. I was gradually being given more responsibilities and was now entrusted to do the cleaning out of the cowshed and pigsties. It was hard work, but I enjoyed it, at least at first.